This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Wednesday, October 14th, 2020. In today's class, I want to discuss Book 6, and so I will. And on Friday, we'll move on to Book 7. I want to essentially, in this discussion, explain why Book 6 comes after Book 5. I want to highlight a couple of important aspects of the chapter, especially its core concept about the nature of reality and knowing the divided line. It would be useful if you have my remarkable graphic of the divided line and the nature of reality, which I sent out, and I'll try to make this intelligible, at least try to read my own handwriting when it comes to it. And then there are three other passages I want to talk about, two of which I mentioned on Monday, and that is Adeimantus's rather trenchant criticism of the Socratic dialectic. It's amazing that here in the heart of the Republic, you actually have Plato putting in the mouth of his brother, Adeimantus, a pretty incisive criticism of what Socrates does in the process of the dialectic. Remember, dialectic is just the fancy Greek word for dialogue. They both come from the same words in Greek, dia, meaning two, and the word logos, which we already have encountered as reason, speech, or account, story. It has a wide range of meanings in Greek. In another version of its etymological development, the root letters become lect. So dialectic and dialogue really mean a conversation between two people. This is the heart of Socratic and perhaps Platonic philosophizing. And again, in this book where Socrates is going to try to explain how the core of human life and happiness is established and manifest in this activity. I know you may think it's watching YouTube videos, but Socrates disagrees with you. So again, it's amazing that here in this chapter where the dialectic is revealed to be the activity that completes the universe, as we'll see, and I don't think that's an understatement. I think there are lots of activities in the universe. There are lots of activities in human life. In this book, Socrates Plato is going to argue that the activity that completes and pulls our identity together as human beings is the activity that gives the universe its meaning. Again, it's amazing in this book that you find in the mouth of Adeimantus such a criticism, I wouldn't say that Adeimantus is rejecting it, but remember these two young men, Glaucon and Adeimantus, are pretty fearless, even though they're disciples of Socrates. They're not hesitant to challenge him. They may spend 90% of the dialogue saying things like, certainly, of course, you must be right, Socrates. But they're not simple wimps. They do challenge their teacher. So, and then the other two things I want to highlight are what I mentioned in passing in the lecture on Monday. One of them is the statement of hedonism and the rejection of hedonism. And you will see this is a theme that goes through, as I mentioned on Monday, Aristotle and Cicero too. And then the other interesting passage is the passage in which Socrates puts a rather sober limit on the ability of human beings to become philosophers and enlightened. Okay, so why do we need to have an extensive discussion of the nature of reality in a book on politics? Well, something like this, I would say. Remember, this book is about justice, human happiness, and the good life. So why in a book on justice, happiness, and the good life do we need to ask the question about the nature of reality, the nature of the universe? and the nature of human knowledge of reality and the universe. Just a summary statement of where we are. Um, as I said, in some ways, the Republican, its core teaching is already established at the end of Book 4, and is profoundly challenged in Book 5 with the 3 waves of reform, laughter. But we're at a critical point because the distinction between the philosophers and the rest of the human beings, the philosophoi, the ones who love knowledge and truth, and the philodoxoi, the ones who are who essentially substitute opinion in their minds for the truth, is at the heart of the Republic's last wave of reform. This is going to be the city, in other words, where if James Madison is right in Federalist 51, and of course he is, that what is government but the greatest of all reflections of human nature, then in some ways, reflecting about politics brings us to this point where we really have to ask, what is human nature, and indeed what's the universe? Because the whole teaching and the justice and preferability of this so-called perfect city depends upon the distinction between opinion and knowledge. And as we've seen from the beginning of the course, Socrates claims that what he's looking for is a form of thought, the dialectic, which replaces opinion with knowledge. So how does the philosopher do that? And how can truth and knowledge come to shape politics? Remember, this is what we've learned about justice. I said something like this on Monday, but let me repeat. What justice is an ordering of the whole and the parts in such a way that each does for what is best for itself, each part does what is best for itself and for the whole. Justice is both a quality of the human soul and of the city, which aids in the perfection of both the soul and the individual human being, and establishes the platform for his or her happiness and of the justice of the city. Since it is impossible for an individual or a city to be truly happy without justice, at least that's what Socrates claims to have established so far, then why does everyone think that the tyrant's so happy? Why does everyone think that the tyrant is the happiest human being, and that injustice is preferable to injustice? Injustice is preferable to justice. Obviously, the case for injustice can only be erected upon opinion, and genuine knowledge of human and political happiness reveals the preferability of justice. Again, I don't know if you guys have been persuaded by Socrates, but just again, and we're going to, when we turn to the ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle in a bit, we'll see the same platform of argument that in some ways the purpose of human life is happiness. And how do you know that? Again, you'll see this is Aristotle's method. In some ways, it's not unlike Socrates' method, but Aristotle is more explicit about this at the beginning of the Ethics. You can't find a human being who doesn't want to be happy. You find plenty of unhappy human beings, and you find plenty of human beings who think that different things lead to happiness. But one thing you cannot find is a human being who wants to be unhappy. So, again, Socrates may or may not have persuaded you at this point that you can't be happy without justice, but at least that's the argument. And that satisfies, in some ways, the challenge of the discussion as it emerged in Book 2. Now, since the case for justice can only be made when one knows the soul and the city, philosophy, through dialectic conversation, is the only way, according to Socrates, to move through and beyond opinion up to knowledge of the soul and the city. Truly knowing what is good for humanity, individually and collectively, requires not only seeing clearly what human beings are, but also what the whole universe is and strives to be. And you're going to see the short term, the paradigmatic term for what the universe is trying to be is good. and we'll see this is represented in the divided line. The process by which the universe generates being and the soul generates knowledge are parallel. As I said on Monday, just to reflect, again, Bloom has a nice discussion of the divided line. You can look on my chartograph of the divided line, um, and remember that in the vertical sides of this diagram, the two sides are the external world, the universe, the objective world, the real world, and the subjective world of human consciousness. Human consciousness, when it's perfected, moves towards knowledge. The universe, when perfected, moves towards being. In fact, you could say, in kind of paradigmatically or schematically, that for Plato, what the universe is the world of transient, individual material things striving to be something they cannot be, because, as we'll see, all material things are transient, and the things that come into being and pass away in Plato's universe are less real than the things that are eternal and do not change. And as you're going to see, so in some ways, the way to describe the universe for Plato is the world of becoming, trying to become being. Now here's the irony of political philosophy and the irony of both Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian, and even Ciceronian political philosophy. The city, so this activity by which the universe becomes being and human consciousness becomes knowledge are parallel. They are united at the top when the human mind knows that which most is, which is the idea of the good. And here's the ironic thing about the city and all this. The city is both the ground of this human activity. Without the city, without the freedom from bare nature that even the initial division of labor generates, human beings wouldn't have the time to gaze at the universe and bring it into being through knowledge and reflection. We'd be scrambling for grubs in the forest. So we need the city not only for our liberation from bare nature and drudgery, but without the city and the world of opinion that it rests on, even philosophy would be impossible. Remember, Socrates didn't want to be exiled from Athens to Sparta or South Carolina because he needs the city. He needs a place where he can talk to human beings and engage in the dialectic. More than the sophists needed the city, etc. So the dialectic, this conversation that finds the common bridge between two minds looking at something, releases the soul from opinion. It dissolves opinion and replaces it with knowledge. But you're going to see not everyone can do this. And as we've already seen, the thumotic, the spiritedness, and which support not only the city by defending it against enemies and everything, but remember the highest range of the thumotic is the belief in right opinion. Again, when you challenge people's opinion, first they'll laugh at you, as they did with Socrates, and then they'll get angry with you. You can always tell when somebody's higher levels of consciousness are thumotic versus logistic or reasonable. If you are engaging with people and you ask them a question and they respond to your question by saying, how do you mean? And is this what you're saying? That's reason at stake. If you say if you say something that challenges people's cherished beliefs, they'll probably respond with something like, you stupid guy, shut the f up. That's a thumotic reaction. Whenever you challenge someone's cherished beliefs, they rise to the level of anger. That's the spirited part of the soul. The spirited part of the soul wants to defend our opinions against being challenged. So the great irony of political philosophy is the very activity that completes human nature and requires the city, in some ways, is harmful to the city and destructive of it because it dissolves opinion, which is why people got sick of Socrates, not just because he was impolite and dressed badly and didn't use deodorant. So anyway, let's look at the divided line. So again, if you follow my description or my chart, or on the notes that I passed out last week or the week before. On the one side, the divided line is the intersection of two lines, actually. The one line separates internal human consciousness, knowing, from external consciousness, the objective world. And the horizontal line separates material, visible things from ideal or invisible, but eternal and permanent things. So on the left side, the being side, you see the things that's outside of human knowledge. Now, again, beneath the line are the single individual material objects of material existence, the things that your senses see. And you'll see that on the corresponding other side of the line is trust. Pistis is the Greek word for trust, or sensation. Why would Plato call sensation trust? It's because people trust their senses to report what's real. So we see things out there. And that's in my fascinating second page, the bottom of the page. Bananas, apples, woodfin, Mordecai, and a strange picture of a dog, and Frozen and Pavarotti. We see individual things reported to our senses, and you'll see that beneath senses are imitations of things, which are images. And that's, of course, you'll see in this picture of being is why artists come off as inferior to philosophers, because artists produce imitations of sensory things of reality. So there's already a derivative or even more unreal aspect to artistic production, whether it's musical or visual or whatever. So on the left side of the divided line, moving up, you'll see that, like, for instance, if you have one apple, you could see the apple, and you see two apples. Even before your mind sees appleosity, the idea that makes them a common thing, you see two-ness. I'm not sure if animals can count, but human beings learn to count pretty quickly, because all you have to do is give 2 pieces of candy to a 2-year-old and give 3 pieces of candy to another 2-year-old, and they'll immediately perceive the difference. The number of things, Plato believes, is part of the existence of things and actually makes us see their individuality, but then also number unites too. And then on the highest level of being are the ideas or forms that actually give unity and purpose and direction to individual material existence. So for instance, and I guess let's just complete the other side. So on the right side, the knowing part, the subjective part of human consciousness, there's a corresponding part of human knowing, the senses and imagination, that report individual material things to our awareness. But thinking, especially in counting and up through abstraction, is an operation that already requires you to abstract or look away from the physicality of things to something that is not embedded in their physicality, but nevertheless organizes it. So when you see 2 bananas and 2 apples, you see bananaosity and appleosity, but you see two-ness. And two-ness doesn't belong to apples as apples, nor does it belong to bananas as bananas. So number is, and being aware of number and mathematics is the human mind moving up from material things and being simply dependent upon them. But then the highest range, and this is the perfection of logos, is intellection, is the mind. And in order to see intellection or ideas, in other words, what happens when the mind knows full truth, numbers can report parts and individual things, but reason not only sees differences between things, it also sees similarities. And it is the ability to see similarity and difference that enables you to see whole and part. Again, I don't know if animals can see wholes, WHOLES. I don't know if their minds extend to that. We'll talk about that when we come back to Aristotle as to what kind of mental acts animals are capable of. So what you see then in the divided line is everything in the universe, inside the human mind and outside of it. And I'll walk through several parts of this and try to interpret my discussion, or my chartograph, or comparogram, or chartograph. inscrutable handwriting. But literally, as you're going to see, when the human mind then reaches up and sees more unity in the universe and starts to see the ideas behind things, the final idea that the human mind sees is the idea of the good. Once the human mind sees the idea of the good, it is in the act of the human mind seeing the notion of the good, which is to say, seeing the wholeness and partness of the universe, and the wholeness, the nature of the whole. Then you could say the universe is complete. So Plato really thinks, or Socrates really seems to suggest, that without the human mind, with all those 13.5 billions of years since the Big Bang and the formation of galaxies, and uh, and um, uh, uh, permanent press clothes, um, the universe was, strictly speaking, waiting for the evolution of the human mind so it could look back and see it. This is not the same thing as the biblical notion of that man is created in the image of God, but there is a certain notion that there's a parallel, that the reason creation is complete in the Bible, in Genesis, once human beings are created, is because uh, God created everything, but only in human beings did He create a part of creation that's capable of seeing creation and also God. So, in some ways, the human world, the cosmological world, becomes complete once human beings are in it. Um, so, um, so let's walk through this chart. So, so things that are material, they are in some ways. Again, if you're looking at the second page of the diagram, this is what I was trying to give complete and uh, uh, total intelligibility to the divided line. What you see around us, and by the way, animals see this too. They see things. Uh, they see. I don't know if an animal could actually see the crude and nearly unrecognizable picture of a carrot that looks as if it was burned in an oven, or bananas that look as if they were run over by a truck. But I can assure you, Mordecai, may he rest in peace, or Frozen, my present part-time cat, sees things. So we're like that because we're animals and we have the same kind of material and structural consciousness that they do. But we also see something they don't see. They see individual things, but they do not see the classes of things. That takes intellection. Animals aren't capable, so far as we know, at least when you read their diaries, they never talk about this. Um, they aren't capable of seeing the unity between two bananas or the unity between two apples. And of course, as you note, when you go up through that diagram, as you go up, you're encompassing in the idea more and more unity. Once your mind sees the classes that unite things, and these classes for Plato and Aristotle, or Plato and Socrates, are not artificial things. It's not accidental that an apple grows up to be an apple, or an apple is an apple, because you wouldn't expect bananas to grow on an apple tree. And it isn't because, um, uh, well, well, we can talk about the great differences in the view of nature that animate modern political philosophy and science from ancient political philosophy. But again, the core of the ancient teaching about nature or forms for Plato is, you say, well, wait, ideas are just in our heads. And Plato, Socrates would say, no, they're not, because it's not accidental that apples uh, don't grow on banana trees. Nature itself organizes the world into classes. So the classes, the ideas that form them, we see them as ideas, but they're not in our heads. They're in our heads, don't get me wrong. But Plato doesn't think that they're projections out on physical reality. The world really does organize itself by classes. And the more that you see the wholeness of existence, you see that those classes become, and the ideas that behind the classes become more and more comprehensive. So bananaosity is one abstraction up from bananas. Appleosity, obviously I invented those words, is one up. And keratosity. And yet you can look at bananas and apples and see they are part of a larger class. They're more unified, and that's fruits and vegetables and plants. Um, and so if you look on the other side, you have Fido and Woodfin and Pulvorti and Frozen and Mordecai, all individual things that belong to classes that are organized. Again, And if Plato and Aristotle, Plato and Socrates were alive today, would say Darwin may have argued that species aren't permanent, and maybe they're not, but at least you could say this: a human being cannot mate with an ape. They may go to grade school with them, but in other words, the notion of a species, even in modern biology, as a discrete community of interbreeding, um, uh, for Plato and Aristotle, would suggest the class nature of things is actually embedded in nature itself. So when we see that Mordecai and Frozen are both cats, when we see that Woodfin and Polvordy are both human beings, well, we're more certain about Woodfin than we are about Polvordy, and so forth. We call them human beings, and then animals, and then we call the larger abstraction or class that unites all those life, and also I added all kinds of other things that you can see, mountains and galaxies and stars. And so as the mind comes to see the way that the universe is organized into classes and ideas, strictly speaking, the world is moving up towards both permanence and unity, and uh, and and then when the human mind sees the whole of the universe, then the mind has seen the idea of the good. Now, one idea that's critical here is Plato doesn't deny that there are things like accidents and chance, as Machiavelli would call it, fortuna. The world is often an unpleasant place, especially if you get stopped for speeding on I-95. But the point I'm making here is, by seeing the structure to the universe, Plato is saying that the universe is good. At the heart of the existence of the universe is goodness, completion, being, unity. And not that the universe is simply good, because again, there are earthquakes and asteroid strikes and pandemics. There is chance in the world. But what Plato would say, and Aristotle is the same, and I think Cicero is the same thing too, is yes, the, by the way, you should know this is not the world of the Bible. In the Bible, strictly speaking, there's no chance. There's only the inscrutable and complete providence of God. God is omniscient and omnipotent. I know Dr. Dunn thinks he is, but I've been talking to God lately, and I've learned a lot about my department chair. You just have to be patient with him. So the the Platonic, Socratic, and I think Aristotelian university is not the biblical universe. It's not simply good because there's no biblical God directing everything. The universe is what it is, according to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And when you see what it is, you'll see that it is pointed towards good, even if, for instance, I mean, just because apple trees want to produce apples doesn't mean that they're going to always succeed. There is such a thing as disease. There's human DNA, but that doesn't mean that every human being born in the world is going to be reach the full limit of there's chance which may undermine, in specific instances, the ability of the universe to attain being and goodness. But the universe is still good. There's an overall direction, point, and purpose to the universe. And again, that's in its highest reaches. That's what the human mind sees. So just to reinforce this, everything, which is what animals and most human beings think is real, is a clump of matter. Attempting to take on identity by embodying an idea. If you could read the diary of an apple, it would report that what it really wants to be is an apple. It doesn't want to be a bug. It doesn't want to be an orange. It wants to be an apple. So material existence is matter, which is atomic, which is material, but yet as material uh, takes on more of the permanence that that idea generates, then it actually becomes something more than what it is, you could say. So this is critical for Plato and Aristotle. Socrates is not just that an idea is in our head that has no relationship to the world out there. Our mind, when it sees an idea, is actually seeing the organizing unity of a class of things. Moreover, the idea is not material. Therefore, unlike the rest of the material world, even stars and galaxies and television shows like The Big Bang Theory, which ran for a long time, or The Simpsons, will eventually go away. Material things come into being and pass away. But think about it: which is longer in being, an individual apple or apples? You and I are going to die. Me probably sooner than you. But human beings, of which we are both examples of, and which gives us our identity, doesn't die with the individual human being. So, so this is the inversion of what people see. Just to remind you, there are two primary sources to opinion. One of them is in the very construction of our cognition. We are animals, and our existence begins with animal perception. But it's a mistake to think that the concrete material things are more real than the ideal things. Plato in Book 6 is trying to invert your understanding of what's real. The other source of opinion, as I've suggested by your writing assignment, and we'll turn to this on Friday, is the cave. In other words, what's in most people's minds are the opinions that they've inherited from their society and the belief that the sensory world in front of them is real. So in some ways, in Book 6, Socrates, Plato is attempting to, using the dialectic, to refine you out of your belief and trust that material things are more real than ideal things. Now, this is an ironic thing because you could say the nature of knowledge contains this irony that that we think the material things are real, but it's actually the ideal class behind them that enables us to grasp them and enables them to survive other than just being a chance. Now, that means that the entire universe is body or matter trying to move up towards greater and greater embodiments of being in unity. This is evident in individual beings trying to be their species idea, but then is visible in the entire order of the universe as beings begin to encompass more unifying reality and idea as their ground of their existence. One can see the universe becoming more complex and unified at the same time, and matter becomes capable of more and more motion and consciousness. So, note, this is great. Life is good. The world is good. But there's a sober reminder here. And that is, in the notes, I say, but note. So note, matter and body can only imitate idea. Matter cannot ultimately become an idea. Matter is transient and eventually only is able to hold on to a coherent idea for a limited number of time. That forms the lifespan of most creatures, the lifespan of galaxies and everything. So even though matter wants to become idea, it can't. It can only approximate idea. And although the order of the universe is eternal and the idea of the good exists beyond change and corruption, the actual amount of idea that a body can take on is determined by chance. So not only is the universe and you and I and everything in it we see around us eternally becoming, it is also eternally passing away. Things that become, that is to say, things that come into being eventually to die. So mortality and transience is the status of all material things, of which you and I are kind of in the middle of this. So human consciousness in this universe, again, starting from the bottom of the divided line on the right side, we see things and then images and poems and art. But better, beginning to count through math and then through the direct seeing of the idea through the dialectic, we move up through sensation towards truth. So sensory knowledge, images, and art, as I said a minute ago, are one source of opinion. Now, that's the divided line. That's the universe according to Plato. And that means, again, that the world is purposeful. It means that human life is good and purposeful. It has an essential task in the universe. Our consciousness, when it's perfected through dialectical awareness of ourselves and the world, complete the world. So this is why, by the way, Platonic and Socratic Aristotelian philosophy is not tragic. It's not always perfect, but But again, the world has purpose. Human beings have purpose. They don't always see it, as you know, because unlike any other part of the universe, what is unique to us, and we'll see this in Aristotle especially, is we, human beings, are the only part of the universe whose ability to be what we are is dependent upon our consciousness of what we are. You don't have to read an instruction manual to a tree in order to have it grow and produce fruit or seeds. Um, uh, uh, I probably did have to show Mordecai how to use the cat door, but you did not have to show Mordecai how to kill baby bunnies. He seemed to have come in the world knowing that. So the ironic aspect of human nature is we're the only part of the universe whose being requires us to know in order for us to be. All right, that's the best that I can do with the divided line, and that's why it's here in Book 6, because it's necessary for dismantling the authority of opinion, insofar as opinion derives from sense and imitation of sense through art. So let me walk you then through these other interesting uh, aspects. First of all, Adeimantus's challenge to the Socratic dialectic. On page 167, and Adeimantus said, Socrates, no one could contradict you in this. But here is how those who hear you now say are affected on each occasion. They believe because of an experience at questioning and answering, they are at each question misled a little bit by the argument. And when the little mistakes, so to speak, are collected at the ends of the argument, the slip turns out to be great and contrary to the first assertions. If Thrasymachus, the sophist, had been capable of being as conscious as Adeimantus is about the nature of the Socratic dialectic, this is what Thrasymachus would have said to Socrates at the in Book 1. This is a pretty. I'm not saying it represents the truth of dialectic, but this is not an unsophisticated criticism of the dialectic. And just as those who aren't clever at playing drafts, like checkers or chess, are finally checked by those who are and don't know where to move, so they are too finally checked by this other kind of draft, played not with counters but speeches. That's essentially Aristophanes' critique of the dialectic in the Clouds. Socrates plays games with language. This is not the common search for the truth. It's Socrates' way of doing combat in words by the clever use of words, which confuses those who aren't used to this kind of arduous questioning. So you can look at the rest of Adeimantus' speech, but you should be aware. In some ways, the rest of Book 6 is a kind of a response to Adeimantus' radical challenge. That this isn't just word games. What the philosopher in the dialectic is doing in engaging in another human conversation is to try to bring two minds seeing ideal reality together. Now, we talk to each other in speech, and speech and reason are identical, are related but not identical, because you can find plenty of people who use speech as forms of lying, stupidity, and inability to think their way out of a wet paper bag. So is speech contains thought, but speech may obscure and prevent the mind from knowing. So the dialectic is a way of intense paying attention to the ideas in another person's head, and through the common effort of filtering out the differences to see the unifying reality that's underneath it. Now you could say maybe that's just produced agreement rather than the common seeing of truth. It's possible, but at least that's the premise of the dialectic. It is not an attack on somebody else, it's an attempt to use somebody else and the common activity of dialectical speech to see the truth that the mind can see. That's why Socrates was not an isolated contemplative who went out in the woods to meditate on being. That's why he had to go around making everybody angry with him, because he was really trying to draw them into his pursuit of the truth. They didn't like it, and they weren't persuaded that he was doing good things, which is why he was accused of corrupting the youth. But that is, in some ways, Book 6 presents the radical challenge that Adeimantos speaks, but also the fuller picture of the universe in which the human mind is an intrinsic part, using philosophic reason to complete the trek to knowledge and therefore complete the being of the universe. That is the final defense of the dialectic. So note that interesting speech of Adeimantos's, and I think book 6, as I just said, is an attempt for Socrates, Plato, to respond to the charge made by Aristophanes, made by Athens, and even Adeimantos, that the dialectic is just word games. Socrates would say, no, it's the way the human mind moves towards the truth, insofar as we can see the truth. Now, the other two things I want to point you to in this book are remarkable, because book 6 has made clear the nature of the good. And on page 189, uh, Socrates is leading Glaucon to do the dialectic, to see the idea and the idea of the good. So let's turn. I'm going to read the middle of that page. This is on page 189, roughly at 508E, 509A. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. And as the cause of knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known. But as fair as these two things are, knowledge and truth, if you believe there is something different from them and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. As for knowledge and truth, just as in the other region it is right to hold light and sight sun-like, but to believe them to be the sun is not right, so too here to hold that these two are like the good is right, but to believe that either of them is the good is not right. The condition which characterizes the good must receive still greater honor. Glaucon's response: you speak of an overwhelming beauty, he said, as if it provides knowledge and truth, but is itself beyond them in beauty. You surely don't mean its pleasure. And Socrates' response, look at Bloom's note here. Socrates doesn't say, oh, you're wrong, or that's probably a mistake. He uses a Greek expression, which is what you would say if somebody violated the third commandment and uttered God's name in vain. You would say, hush, don't say that. Again, it's funny. Socrates isn't saying what you're saying is false. He's saying you must not say that. Now, I think he thinks it's false. But why not just say that that idea is wrong? There's almost a moral dimension to his response to Glaucon. Hush, Glaucon, I said, but consider its image still further in this. So not only is it false that the good is pleasure, or the pleasure is the good, there's something about saying this and believing it, which is not only an intellectual mistake, it leads to the complete undermining of human life. It leads to the destruction of human life. Now, as I said in my discussion on Monday, let me repeat that. The word for pleasure in Greek is hedon, and it survives in English in the phrase hedonism. The idea that pleasure is the good, we will encounter this idea several times later in the course. It is most associated with the ancient philosophers of Epicurus, hence Epicurean, and Lucretius, the two materialist Greek Greco-Roman philosophers who argued that the world was just matter in motion. And pleasure is material pleasure, physical pleasure is the good of existence. Now, the reason that you have to say hush, and again, you'll see when we come back to Aristotle and the Ethics, these two things sound like the same thing, but they are profoundly different. On the one hand, pleasure is the good, is this profound error and at the heart of hedonism. The Socratic or Platonic correction of that is the good is pleasurable. What's the difference between saying pleasure is the good and the good is pleasurable? As you're going to see, once you say the good is pleasure, you destroy the ability to make the distinction between higher and lower, between the body and the soul. In fact, once you say pleasure is the good, as Epicurus and Lucretius did, let me give you a little taste of Cicero that we'll finish the course with. The argument is that becomes nihilism, because once you say the pleasure is the good, then you can't distinguish between kinds of pleasure. And once you can't distinguish between the kinds of pleasure, then you have lost all ability to live life coherently. So the Platonic rejection of hedonism, and which is also the Aristotelian and Ciceronian, is that to say pleasure is the good, hedonism is nihilism. Now, nihil is the Latin word for nothing, and nihilism means nothingism, that you can't say anything about human life, that there's no organizing principle, no knowledge, no truth, no goodness. Nihilism means there is no coherence to the universe and therefore no guide for human choice and action. So those of you that have children or intend to, you will discover that most parents don't want to raise their children as nihilists because, um, uh, uh, generally speaking, they won't clean up their rooms. But we'll come back to this. This is a very important point. So the good exists as the good. It is beautiful. It is pleasurable. But pleasure is not the good. The other interesting passage that I wanted to bring your attention to is on page 173. And in laying out the dialectic and why the consciousness of the philosopher is so different from the non-philosopher, on page 173, roughly around 493e and 494a. No, he said, nor do I suppose I shall hear one. Well, then, this is Socrates speaking, keep all this in mind and recall this question. Can a multitude accept or believe that the fair itself, rather than the many fair things, or that anything itself is, rather than the many particular things? Not in the least, Glaucon says. Then it's impossible, I said, that a multitude be philosophic. Yes, it is impossible. Which is not only to explain why non-philosophers think philosophers are idiots and good for nothings, but if Socrates, Plato is right, this is the other great line. Hedonism, as I suggested on Monday and what just a minute ago, is not only the main difference between ancient political philosophy and modern political philosophy. The other one is on this question of can the masses become philosophic. Remember, even the perfect city, guided and ruled by philosophers, still uses opinion to bind the non-philosophic parts of the city. That's the noble lie in Book 3. And so, if Socrates and Plato are right, ancient political philosophy is not tragic, but it's sober. It would look on the modern project to raise the consciousness of all of humanity through scientific method and philosophic enlightenment, which is at the heart of the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement unleashed by modern political philosophy, as utopian. Because if it's true that the masses can never fully ascend beyond opinion, then there may be a limit to the amount of progress and goodness that human life can see. So discuss this question more. It is of tremendous weight and importance. And so you just have a good Wednesday.